With a major selection of the looks your kiddos love starting at just $4 in the Walmart app, a new school year means a stylish new them. Who knew? Find skater skirts and Crocs that say, I'm casual but cool. Sparkly sneakers that say, it's my classroom, you're just learning in it. And preppy polos that say, I'm the teacher's pet, even if they're mommy's menace at home. Find their favorite styles starting at just $4 in the app. The Walmart you thought you knew is now new.
Gatorade is the #1 proven electrolyte blend designed to hydrate better than water. So you can lose more sweat and raise your game. Gatorade, is it in you?
In Tusculum, Pisa, they wed King Conrad and the daughter of Sicily, still very young, accompanied by unheard of wealth. So says Bernold of Constance. Welcome to Fortune's Wheel Podcast, the podcast that explores the infinitely fascinating and oft overlooked high and late Middle Ages. I'm Jonathan, your host, and what you can expect to hear on this show is a story of our collective Western history, warts and all, unabashedly and unashamed. This season is called All Roads Lead to Clermont, and it attempts to bring us up to date on the West leading right up to the call for Holy War. And we followed the reign of King William II of England and his two brothers, Robert Curthose and Henry Beauclerc, up north, and taken a quick snapshot of Iberia crumbling under the weight of the Almoravid conquest already. In addition to those, we've also established the two major thoroughfares that Crusaders will be using in the coming confrontation, the Venetian-controlled Adriatic and the Kingdom of Hungary. Also, Matilda of Canossa does it again. And with this episode, we expand upon the Council of Piacenza's agenda and its first 4 precedent-setting days. And we see on this episode days 5, 6, and 7, along with Conrad III's very interesting moves in the months after Piacenza. Before we begin, if you believe in what's happening on this show, bringing our shared history to life, warts and all, free to the public with absolutely no more paywalls ever, please consider donating to my caffeine-mediated research and writing through the website and app Buy Me a Coffee. With opportunities for one-time donations and even a monthly donation plan, you can voluntarily contribute to the continuation of this show. And while you're at it, feel free to listen on YouTube too, which has our full back catalog as well as all new episodes as they're published. These links are all in the show notes. Now, let's get to it. This is episode 166, entitled The Council of Piacenza, Part 3. Thank you for your support, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. It had been an explosive day 4, and everyone left shook at the allegations of Empress Adelaide against Emperor Henry IV. And they were eager to see what Day 5 had to offer. I imagine it's something like this. Piacenza's Basilica courtyard. Those assembled were chilled by early spring alpine winds flowing off the mountains to the north. The council convenes beneath a gray sky. Rows of bishops and abbots cluster in tight knots, woolen cloaks drawn against the cold. A quiet, subdued flurry of suppressed excitement was palpable as they eagerly awaited the drama that was to unfold next. At the dais, Pope Urban II sits like a general preparing for war, flanked by notaries with ink-stained fingers and very suspicious eyes. A stir at the eastern end of the courtyard. 3 men enter in courtly Byzantine robes, silk-faded, travel-worn. Their boots were cracked, showing that they had been on a long, long journey already. One bore the golden badge of Constantinople's imperial eagle, a derivation of the ancient Roman eagle. The crowd murmured as they walked forward. Many weren't expecting this. These were, in the flesh, ambassadors of the Emperor of Eastern Rome himself. As these men approached Urban, Urban leaned forward slowly in his seat, raised a gloved hand, and nodded to the crowd as if to say, "Yes, I know. I know this is unusual. Please quiet down." The leader of the delegation stepped forward, bowing his head low. His voice trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of the message he bore. He might have addressed Urban with the usual courtesies, but the room itself seemed to freeze in the moment when he said this: "We come not with gold or gifts, but with grief." The man paused, hoping his Latin, heavily accented, was clear enough. This pause would normally have allowed a flurry of whispering to erupt from a crowd such as this, but everyone was awestruck by not only the man's words, but by his mere presence. This, of course, was certainly not new information to Urban. I mean, he had planned the whole thing. Piacenza was his event after all, and he let the heavy pause continue for a spell longer, until he smiled at the man with an imperceptible nod, conveying that his words were clear and they were understood. With relief, the ambassador continued in his accented Latin, expanded on the message he was sent to give the Western world. All ears, bishops, nobility, servants, all were listening, all were leaning forward where they stood. What might the man be here to report on, to ask for? The man went on to say something like this: "The lands of the East are overrun. The Turks defile the churches. Jerusalem is silent, her bells stilled. Antioch burns, Nicaea groans under the chains of heresy, and Constantinople itself, our queen, and all of Christendom's protector against the Muslim, she trembles in the shadows of Islam's approach." And the crowd is absolutely silent at this. Muslims had always been the boogeyman around the Mediterranean, just like Christians were the boogeymen for those Muslims in Iberia or Sicily. But this was a Christian crowd. To think that the cities of Eastern Rome were falling to encroaching Muslims was news to many of them. And to think that Constantinople itself, widely regarded as the center of the world for so long, much to the chagrin of folks in Rome, to think Constantinople was in danger of falling, people simply couldn't believe their ears. I imagine the envoy reaches beneath his cloak and produces a thin scroll sealed with the sigil of Emperor Alexius I as a testament proving that what this man was saying was true and more or less straight from the mouth of the emperor himself. The man may have followed it up with a formal plea: "We beg the swords of the West to come east. Lend us your arms, your oaths, your coin, and your blood, before Christendom's imperial cradle becomes its tomb." Again, the crowd stunned, but it was probably then that their mouths began to open in quick whispers to those around them. Before the crowd formed a mind of its own, Urban recognized this as the perfect opportunity to step in and gear their whispers and later conversations in a single direction. I imagine him rising from his seat, holding his hands up, and when he was sure he had their attentions again, he may have said something like this: "Sons of Christ, our brethren in the East suffer while we sit idly by and debate over kings and a German emperor and their overreaches of authority and their depravities. While we argue over trivialities, the Virgin weeps in Jerusalem. The Holy Sepulchre lies trampled and forsaken. Shall we, sons of Peter, simply leave our brothers in chains and our sisters beneath the Muslim?" Surveying the crowd, he probably continues, "I ask not for swords today, but for your hearts. Go to your flocks, your families, your kings and your communities. Speak of what you have heard here. Tell them of what you have heard with your own ears. The words given from a brother, personally selected and sent by the Emperor of Eastern Rome himself. And when I call upon you again, whenever that shall be, let no man remain silent." Well, of course, this is a product of my own imagination of how the scene unfolded, but I rather like it. Bernold of Constance, in his Chronicon, remember he was an eyewitness to the entire Council of Piacenza and wrote many years later. Well, he wrote the following, quote, "The Byzantine delegates appeared, humbly implored that they offer help against the pagans," end quote. Bernold added a bit about swearing oaths to the Emperor of Eastern Rome, but this was most likely a later embellishment, a later conflation of Piacenza and Clermont, which was a common occurrence that stains the records about Piacenza. That mistake, that conflation of the two events, Piacenza and Clermont, well, that mistake is what makes it aggravatingly impossible to get a full, accurate picture of Piacenza. But Robert Somerville surmised the following about Day 5, quote, "In hindsight, the most important attendees were the ambassadors sent by the Byzantine Emperor Alexius I Komnenos. Alexius hoped Western Knights could help him restore territories lost to the Seljuks. Upon hearing the Byzantine ambassador's plea, Urban asked those present to lend aid to the Byzantine Emperor," end quote. Now, it wasn't as simple as Urban rising and saying these things. There were no doubt intense conversations had throughout the rest of the day, either in the presence of the Pope and his Byzantine guests. I can't imagine the upper echelon of Piacenza were given a Q&A session with the Greeks, or in their own breakout sessions or meals later on. As Somerville said, this was a big moment. Piacenza had started off full synod as it issued canons, offered reconciliation to schismatic priests and leaders, and just all around reoriented the church itself going forward. But by day 4, when Empress Adelaide gave her testimony condemning her imperial husband, it began to dip the synod's toes into the realm of being a council, if you remember that distinction we made between the two before. Well, day 5 was focused solely on matters external to the church. Well, okay, kind of. It's just also difficult, right? How external was it to the church? If you're talking about taking back the Holy Land, it's very muddled. So it involved the church in that Jerusalem was under Muslim control, and the cities up and down the Levant, from the Red Sea to the Bosporus in the northeastern Anatolia region, they were falling one by one with strikingly brutal precision and efficiency and speed to the Muslims. This was certainly a threat to the faith itself. However, the Pope wasn't entertaining ambassadors of the Patriarch of Constantinople asking the West to flood the Holy Land with priests and monks. No, he was entertaining ambassadors sent directly by a secular ruler, an emperor, who was appealing to the West to send its best and most dangerous warriors to help not only defend Christendom in the Holy Land, but to drive back Muslims so far as to no longer be a threat to them anymore, to be a threat to Eastern Rome itself. And here is where I feel like the Papal Synod becomes pretty firmly a secular council. It took the appeal of Alexius Komnenos to do this, and I believe Pope Urban II was absolutely okay with it. In fact, it may have been of his own design. I mean, more than a few historians over the years who have concluded that Urban had already considered an Eastern expedition of some sort by 1095. Well, let's think about this. We know that he had been corresponding with rather high up folks in Constantinople for a number of years already. We know that Urban invited this Byzantine delegation to be a part of this particular event in Piacenza. We also know that the Council of Piacenza itself was designed to assert his authority over Christendom. Expanding upon this, we see him taking step after step, not only at Piacenza, but in those previous 3 synods he held before entering Rome, to impose his papal authority as the supreme authority within the whole church. To give people a shocking thing to consider, and you could be the one who becomes the figurehead for what to do next about that shocking thing. He allowed the Byzantine delegation to shock the Western world And at Piacenza, he was able to steer the conversation how he wanted it. Who else at Piacenza would be the figurehead except for Pope Urban II? We're talking about liberating the holiest city on earth, Jerusalem. So yes, I too agree that Urban had plans on the east already. Well, Gregory VII did too, if you remember. His just fizzled before they were able to happen. And speaking of other popes, we can't forget about Victor III's invasion of a small emirate in North Africa back in 1087, or Alexander II's blessing of the massacre of Muslims at Barbastro in Iberia way back in 1067. This whole thing had been ramping up for decades. Let's be clear about something. Pope Urban II did not invent the idea of crusade. And he certainly didn't formulate the language used by popes to condone actions against non-Christians. Again, Alexander and other popes were working all that out long before Urban entered Rome in the first place, and long before the ambassadors graced everyone's presence at Piacenza in 1095. So what place does Urban hold in the whole topic of crusading? Well, that'll be worked out over the next few episodes, but at Piacenza specifically, Urban played his cards perfectly. Urban could have very easily jumped on the chance, fired everyone up, but as I said before in the show, Urban's long game was impeccable. He simply told them to take what they heard and go home. That's it. Spread it around, spread it everywhere they went. Why? Well, I think it's because Piacenza had tens of thousands of attendees, sure. But if he wanted to send an army large enough to fight in the heart of Islam itself, the Holy Land, then he would need to fire up more than those present. Before he declared anything official, he needed Europe itself to be warmed up, to be fired up, and to be ready to move when called upon. He needed to let the pot boil. This is big. Like this is really big. And I'm shocked and disappointed that Piacenza itself isn't given more airtime in the records, or really any airtime for that matter. I kind of just fell into this topic. I didn't know it existed before about a year ago. The Council of Piacenza marks the moment when the Pope officially forwards a request to Western Christendom at large for Western military aid, not for heresy, not for reform, but for all-out war. Piacenza would clear the way for what would occur at Clermont in 8 short months from then. Europe would have just 8 months to spread the word, get heated and fired up, and wait for the official call. Piacenza was the necessary spiritual and political buildup to Clermont's more official call for crusade. So, that was a lot. With just 2 days left, though, of the council, people's heads must have been absolutely spinning. They've had condemnations and reconciliations. They've had arguments and decrees about the Eucharist and transubstantiation. They've had accusations of truly evil and unforgivable acts committed by the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And they've just had a delegation from Eastern Rome asking for Western aid against the encroaching Muslim Turks, publicly made, by the way. No one could have foreseen what Piacenza would turn into when it started. Now, March 6, day 6 of the Council of Piacenza was a rather bland day in comparison to all that. It was certainly a bustling, busy day, but there were no Michael Bay-esque explosions or a few good men-like trials, you know? They spent the day ironing out the previous 5 days, finalizing at least 15 new canons, everything from denunciations of the heresies to reinforcing Gregorian reforms, and then publicly reading them aloud for all tens of thousands assembled to hear. Officially, there would be no more pay-to-pray schemes, there would be no more open discussion about transubstantiation, there would be no more questions about the legitimacy of, or illegitimacy of anti-Pope Clement III. Sacraments would forevermore be free of charge. Clergy would remain celibate and married only to the church and her followers. And Henry IV and all royalty across Christendom would stay in their secular lanes and never again interfere with ecclesiastical matters. Piacenza was Urban's thunderbolt. But the last piece of crucial business to be completed at Piacenza was what to do next. After much discussion, the Pope, his Curia, and other leading officials decided to deputize every single person in Piacenza. Guest, servant, merchant, it didn't matter. They decided to deputize, in a sense, everyone to go back home and spread every single detail of what occurred, the good, the bad, and even the sacrilegious. As mentioned, Piacenza was the fuse being lit for what was to occur in just 8 short months. No one but Urban and a select few knew it, but they put everyone to work all the same. The word spread throughout the city, and as people filed away, they knew their solemn duty. Again, spread the word. Oh, especially that bit about Eastern Rome. What's more is that they decided when they all would convene again to discuss the progress since Piacenza. They decided on the date, November 18. Now, one of the noblemen in attendance at Piacenza was one Count William VI of Auvergne. The county of Auvergne was a centrally located and largely peaceful county within the Kingdom of France. Count William VI offered his land, his support, his finances, and his security forces to Pope Urban II, much in the same way Countess Matilda did at Piacenza. Auvergne was a smart, low-risk place for the Pope to gather French clergy and nobles. Within the county of Auvergne was a peaceful and economically vibrant little city called Clermont. And it would be here, on November 18th, 1095, that the Christian world would once again descend upon. For his next plans, Urban knew he'd draw some support from everywhere. But as I've tried my absolute best to build on this show so far, Urban knew the core of the warrior classes in Europe were without question from France. For this next part, he would need France. With that settled, the next day, March 7th, day 7 of the Council of Piacenza, saw closing masses celebrated throughout the various cathedrals and temporary chapels in and around the city. After Mass, folks probably packed up, said their goodbyes, ate their last communal meals with new friends, made their last few haggles in the markets, and their last few traveling accommodations. And a local Piacensan must have felt overwhelmed as they had a week earlier, only this time, instead of their city flooded with visitors, they saw the horizon-size ebbing of a sea of people leaving throughout the day. Inside the papal tents and important buildings filled with important people, letters were hurriedly scribbled out and sent to all corners of Christendom. Episcopal bishops and secular envoys made their last few deals and connections before dispersing as well. And Pope Urban II, his Curia, and select others, maybe even including Matilda of Canossa, maybe not, left within a day or two of the end of the council, hastily making their ways to Rome, where the planning for this next meeting at Clermont in November was immediately commenced. And that, my friends, those were the details. The best historians could put together given the scant records and chronicles of the events of Piacenza. Was it a perfect recounting? Of course not. But the information presented was at least tied to the records we have and the conclusions historians far more informed and brighter than me have put together. What we can't sleep on was that Piacenza, though barely mentioned in our own history books today, was monumentally important. The amount of issues tackled there, the power plays made there. I may be completely off base here, but I'll stick my head out and say that what happened at Clermont wouldn't have happened without Piacenza happening first. There were just too many building blocks laid and built upon at Piacenza that would lead to the outcome of Clermont. Piacenza was big. Before we get out of here, I want to address just one more important character to this whole storyline. Conrad III.
My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
This episode is sponsored by Friskies, who would like to tell your cats hi. Now, if that didn't get your cat's attention, there's one thing that always does the trick. Just pour some Friskies crunchy food in the bowl and you'll hear those paws come running. Works every time. With so many Friskies choices, you can always bring your cats running from their secret napping spots. There's always more to explore. See for yourself at friskies.com or visit your local store.
Hey, it's Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. Now, I was looking for fun ways to tell you that Mint's offer of unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month is back. So I thought it would be fun if we made $15 bills. But it turns out that's very illegal. So there goes my big idea for the commercial. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
Conrad III, again, born to Henry IV and Bertha of Savoy back in 1074, well, he was just 20 or 21 when he attended the Council of Piacenza in March of 1095. He was officially declared Henry's heir earlier in his life and been crowned co-king of Germany, but he'd grown up mostly in Lombardy, outside of Germany. And with his pro-Matilda leanings, seeing through his father's wickedness, the Lombards themselves chose to crown him King of Italy, much to the anger of Emperor Henry IV. He'd stayed out of the spotlight for much of the time, but by 1093, he'd openly declared his support for Matilda of Canossa, and his patronage for the cities who would, after Canossa in 1092, openly rebel against the Holy Roman Emperor and form La Liga. These cities were, of course, Milan, Lodi, Cremona, and Piacenza, among a few others. In March of 1095, Conrad attended the council at Piacenza as an honored guest of Matilda's. But he wasn't there representing his father, obviously. Conrad was openly declaring his support for Pope Urban II. In fact, everything he said at the council rose from a backroom whisper to loud declarations of support for the Pope, for Matilda, and for all priests who had been harmed by his father's actions. Sadly, the only recorded mention of him at Piacenza, so far as I know, in 1095, was his backing of his stepmother, Empress Adelaide. We have no more mention of him from the likes of eyewitness Bernold of Constance or the near contemporary chroniclers like Eckhard of Ora and Guibert of Nogent. So the reason I bring up Conrad is because we know he was at Piacenza. We know he was an honored guest. We know he spoke out against his father there publicly. But what came after Piacenza implies that a lot must have been happening off the page, so to speak, for Conrad during the events at Piacenza. He wasn't just an idle viewer of things. In fact, the only thing we know for sure is that he publicly declared his support for the accusations leveled at Henry IV by his stepmom. That, sadly, is the only recording we have about him. But Conrad's real moves, his first real moves, one could argue, came immediately after the close of the council. As you know, the Council of Piacenza formally ended on March 7th, 1095, but by April 10th, just 1 month after, April 10th at the northern Italian city of Cremona, there was a peculiar ceremony involving both Conrad III and Pope Urban II. In a move of symbolic humility, Conrad became Urban's strator. Okay, what's a strator? In Roman and Byzantine imperial courts, a strator was a formal position within the schola stratorum, which was a class of mounted attendants under a count of the stable, or what we in English have all come to call the constable. Now, back in the day, it was a very real position. However, by the 11th century, the strator had become a relic, so to speak, of bygone days. If it was even practiced at all, it was completely ritualistic, signifying humble service. The nobleman, or even king in a couple cases, simply led the Pope's horse on foot, showing his humility and obedience to the Bishop of Rome. Now, as a ritual, it began under Constantine the Great's reign. So we're talking way back in the 300s or so. Some notables who played the role of strator were none other than Pepin the Short, and even Charlemagne himself, which put Conrad III in some pretty incredibly high company. Well, by the 9th century, as the papacy grew in strength and papal imperial relations became more strained, the strator ritual fell out of practice. By Conrad III's time, no strator gesture, so far as I can tell, had been performed since probably Charlemagne, or one of his immediate successors. The reason was that these Holy Roman emperors and these French kings, who were all rising in power and influence and consolidating their kingdoms and whatnot, well, they didn't want to give the wrong impression, It was a pride thing, to be quite honest. If they continue to humble themselves to a pope, then that would imply a symbolic power monopoly across Christendom. At a time when both the pope and the secular rulers were both rising in power, well, something had to give. Secular rulers thought it antithetical to humble themselves after claiming for so long that they were the sole power in their domains. Well, at Clermont on April 10th, 1095, just weeks after Piacenza, when the gauntlet had once again been thrown down, not just at the feet of Emperor Henry IV, but also every other secular ruler within Christendom, well, there Conrad III, King of Italy, remember, and co-king of Germany, only one of which his father approved of, officially led the Pope's horse by the bridle, and he did it on foot. This one singular walk down the streets of Cremona, in front of all the villagers, revived a long-dead act of humility a secular ruler could show toward a pope. Witnesses who saw the event recorded that it was carefully orchestrated to match the records of when Constantine the Great did the same for Pope Sylvester I. This was a public concession to papal spiritual authority, a vivid display of paternal defeat and papal supremacy, and a dramatic reversal of imperial protocol. Like, dramatic. And all Papa Henry could do was read the reports from Verona, still hemmed in and prohibited from crossing the Alps to return home. His empire was crumbling, and it seemed that Urban and Matilda had successfully begun grooming the next choice of Holy Roman Emperor, much in the same way Henry had done with his choice of Pope. Urban and Matilda were orchestrating it all. Now, this foot service offered by Conrad was more than political theater. It gave Urban some serious political ammunition going forward, aligning himself with sacred imperial tradition while undercutting Henry IV's legitimacy, all the while pushing this new kid to the fore as a viable, humble, and strong replacement. So this one small move of Conrad III to partake in a medieval ritual of subservience to the Pope elevated both Urban higher and higher, as well as himself. It was a political masterstroke by Urban and Matilda. Piacenza was all about returning the church to its earlier roots and purity. Well, here's a move to return the Holy Roman Empire itself to its earliest, purest roots. But if I may offer a tiny little spoiler about Conrad's ritual of humiliation, the cold hard fact remains. This was a one-off medieval reenactment of imperial humility. There was a really close and genuine effort put in the year 1155. So what is that, 60 years or so after Conrad? At the city of Sutri, involving the one and only Frederick Barbarossa. But he never went through with it for reasons I'm positive we'll get to when we get there. But Conrad's was the last actual performance of the strator ritual of humility. Now, everyone gave 5 days for word to spread, certainly to Verona, about Conrad's act of subservience to the Pope, but on April 15th, Conrad and Urban upped the ante once again. Conrad knelt before the Pope in a public ceremony and swore to defend, quote unquote, life, limb, and the Roman papacy, promising to forever turn his back on lay investiture, which was obviously a direct slap to his father's face, and to embrace all means all here, all other Gregorian reforms. In return, Conrad would receive papal and secular support in securing all crowns and honors and titles going forward. April of 1095 was a big month for young Conrad III. And you can clearly see the aims of Urban and Matilda here by supplying the public with a ready candidate, a solid and vouched for replacement for Emperor Henry IV. Any action taken against the emperor could be easier supported. It's not like, invading, say, Iraq or Libya and having no plan for what happens after, except to parrot the words, regime change, Maybe I'm misspeaking here. No, Urban and Matilda were answering people's questions of what comes next should they support overthrowing the emperor. And Conrad checked all the boxes: age, experience, ideology, loyalty, heredity, boom, boom, boom. But what came next was, it was far bigger than either of those two things. Urban and Matilda arranged for Conrad to get married. Born to a wealthy, powerful, and highly influential Norman family, Constance was the daughter of none other than Count Roger of Sicily and his second wife, Arenberga of Mortain. The details of Constance's early life are obviously scarce. She emerges primarily in political context, but we know she was born around 1082 in either Calabria or Sicily. She was also the first of many Norman Italian Constances, so she set a high bar, it seems, for Constances going forward. She was born and raised in Roger's tumultuous Sicily, but she would reach womanhood in a calmer Sicily, to be sure. Her upbringing consisted of Latin, Greek, and Arab influences. She was the product of a melting pot, which was so rare in those days. Roger had cultivated a truly tolerant society on the island, paving the way for the word Sicilian to stand on its own as its own culture in not many decades from this point. It wouldn't gain its peak status for another century or so, but Constance grew up in the earliest winds of that very change. Now, Constance would have been around 13 or 14 when she was married off to King Conrad III of Italy. But to be fair, Conrad himself was only 21 or so. So the age gap wasn't terrible. I mean, I'm saying this, sounds weird to say that, but given the time 1,000 years ago, it wasn't a terrible marriage proposal. So Countess Matilda knew a thing or two about marriages, but she must have known this to be a good match because she joined Urban in promoting it. In mid-1095, probably July or August, envoys were sent in both directions. The deals had already been cut, and both Roger and Conrad were pleased with the marriage negotiations. Roger sent his daughter off to Pisa, reportedly arriving with a fleet of Norman warships and knights along with a substantial dowry, reflecting the importance of this new alliance between the German boy king and the insanely powerful Sicily. But this did more than just boost Count Roger's esteem throughout the continent, which it most certainly did. But it also strengthened the alliance between the papacy and Sicily, and even Matilda's Tuscany and Sicily. To say nothing of Duke Roger Borsa's alliance with the papacy, Count Roger of Sicily allied himself directly with the powers north of Apulia and Calabria, thus separating himself somewhat from his nephew's hold on the island. It seemed that Roger's domain, ripe with Greek and Islamic cultural ties, now had a direct bridge to papal policy, and this, of course, rubbed off onto his reputation among his European peers. But this alliance also elevated Sicilian prestige, raising Count Roger's diplomatic score, marking him as a quote-unquote kingmaker in Italian and imperial politics. That is not a bad reputation to have. But I also propose that this marriage did something more immediate, and I dare say important given the context of Piacenza. I maintain that this elevation of Roger's status also spread his story of his conquest of Sicily like wildfire across Christendom. To me, Roger's story of what happened in Sicily would stand as a blueprint, or at least as proof, that war against Muslims to regain lands once Christian was possible. This marriage wasn't about love, nor was it even about heirs. It didn't produce a single heir, actually. For Constance, it raised her from Sicilian princess, so to speak, to queen consort of papal Italy. For Conrad, it further distanced himself from his father and embedded him in papal and Norman power structures. And for Count Roger, it turned his Sicilian domain into a critical linchpin of papal diplomacy, underscoring the importance of Sicily, not just in the Mediterranean trade, but in the crucial power plays of 11th century Christendom. The story of a Norman conquest in Sicily became a sort of proof of concept for what would be called the First Crusade. Until next time.